So somebody asked an interesting question in the comments today, which I read and thought about and then immediately couldn't find their comments again. So apologies to them because I can't give credit. The spirit of the question was simply this: what should Brits do when President Trump comes for his imminent state visit to the United Kingdom? You'll recall that Prime Minister Keir Starmer's first visit to the White House, he handed Trump a letter from the King extending an invitation for a state visit. And this was a very special, a very unprecedented incident, Starmer stressed, because it would make Trump the very first leader to have been invited to a state visit twice. Such a great honour. Now please let's have a trade deal. Well, promises made, promises kept. That state visit is due to take place in 10 days' time from the shooting of this video. Conveniently during parliamentary recess, so members of Parliament won't be forced to endure the President addressing them in the House of Commons. When Starmer invited Trump, he said a bunch of stuff that was pretty norm-breaking, musing about making Canada the 51st state, for instance, but he used to say all sorts of garbage and most of it never came to anything. At least that's how leaders were framing their wishful thinking at the time. So Starmer knew that he had to flatter and make a big show of honouring the man in the White House, but at that point it hadn't become quite so impossible to ignore that this was an administration that was going to energetically dismantle all the democratic guardrails in its own country, to seek to extort the world into one-sided economic relationships, and to seek to hand Ukraine to Vladimir Putin, and so on and so on. But now we have seen all of those things, at least those of us not imprisoned within the Fox News echo chamber, because a lot of those guys don't seem to have noticed much as to why the rest of the world seems not to be happy about recent events. So the most natural thing in the world is that some will want to protest, at least are considering doing so. As I started preparing for this video, I kind of assumed that such protests were being organised, but I'm only going to look at those at the end, see if my presumptions about them are borne out. First of all, is there a case for not protesting at all? All right, well, here's the argument for that. And I guess there are two parts. One, you could say Brits should be polite to a guest to their country. Trump was, after all, duly elected by the American people. He's been invited in that capacity as a representative of the American people and so on. If this were 200 years ago, or indeed if Britain were a Southeast Asian country today, where public politeness is a matter of national pride, then that argument might have flown. But obviously, not going to happen today. So the other part would go something like this. The world has become a more dangerous place. For better or for worse, the UK government, our government, is currently following a strategy of keeping up the illusion of normality, positioning the UK as its traditional role of the staunchest of US allies. This gets little credit from the White House, which doesn't value allies, but it gets some when delivered with the royal family and all the pomp and the flattery that the British state can muster. This strategy is about trying to use some degree of leverage to make the damage from Trump less than it might otherwise have been. And you've seen it in action with Starmer, as well as Macron and Mark Rutte and one or two others, talking Trump down from the ledge of Putinism whenever he's had a chance to fall under its spell. So the people of Britain who want to mitigate the damage of Trump should not take actions to undermine the approach that its government is taking. That's a better argument, but still kind of falls apart pretty quickly, because one, no nation on earth simply lines up unquestioningly behind its government strategy. I suppose except for ones that have iron grip authoritarian control, which of course is exactly the approach Trump is taking that we would be inclined to protest about in the first place. And two, the US is supposed to be championing free speech. We know that by that, they don't mean speech that they actually disagree with, but at least force them to reveal that by their words and their own actions. And three, it's not as though Trump isn't used to there being protests wherever he goes. So he's not going to take it personally to the United Kingdom. If he can decide to attend the US Open tennis men's finals, amongst numerous other events, knowing there'll be some significant booing, in some places mixed with cheering, in others maybe not, then he should cope perfectly well with the fact that there are some people protesting in the UK. Then the question I would ask would be, what is the point of a protest? Usually in these situations, you get generic protest. There's no strategy because you get loose coalitions of protest organisations, most of which are not skilled in campaign strategy. And so you just get a generic screw you type protest. For Trump's first state visit, for instance, in his first term, they were there with their generic anti-Trump banners, some jokey placards, and I recall a giant inflated Trump baby balloon, just to express the contempt people felt. And that's fine, if you want protest as recreation. A day out, wave a banner, do some chanting, go home as though you feel like you made a stand. My presumption is when I look to see what's being planned this time, it'll be some variation on that theme. Well, I would want to ask instead, given the current moment we're in, what is the ask? Who is the ask being made of? So this is an analysis channel, not a campaigning one. But if it were a campaigning one, you would start with that question. What's the purpose? What's the impact you could realistically make? Who's it targeted at? One possible answer to that, and the most easy, intuitive one, is, okay, we want to send a message to Trump that he's not welcome. That's the most likely messaging. Or we want to send a message to Trump, we don't like what he's doing because he's acting like a dictator. And that's fine, but you have to bear in mind it is doomed to fail. Because A, the British state will keep Trump's physical exposure to such protests to a minimum, and B, Trump will write off all the protests as radical leftist lunatics and just won't care what you think anyway. We too have radical leftist lunatics, he will say to the king, and the king will likely say something polite back to him, which is calculated to change the subject quickly, a skill he has been practicing in many different locations with many different people for his entire life. And by the way, if he doesn't, and if he ends up in an argument with Trump, that will be taken as a massive failure of the British state. Not Trump having truth bombs dropped on him. Pro-hack any social media post that purports to show sparky content creators dropping truth bombs, pretty much guaranteed they're talking complete garbage. But I digress. So, is there an alternative? If you protest in Britain, it seems to me the natural target for your message, in this case anyway, this sort of thing, should be the British government. I said earlier that the British positioning, America's ally through thick and thin, that was decided before the full nature of this new American administration was really evident. So for me, the real question is this: at what point does that positioning for our nation become untenable? At what point does normalising Trump's America become more damaging than the potential good you hope to achieve by doing it? Or maybe even on a moral basis, not just a pragmatic one, which is my go-to. At what point do you have to say, this is now a line we will not cross? This is the sort of abuse we would call out in any other country. And so we now have to choose to do the same here, even knowing that there will be consequences for doing it. We now have a state that has taken people off the street and sent them without due process to a hellhole prison in El Salvador. We now have a state that has used deadly force against a boat of completely unknown people in international waters without legal cause. We have a state that has threatened a territory controlled by a NATO member with annexation, possibly with the use of force, to wit Greenland. Any one of those should have provoked expressions of concern on diplomatic levels if they had come from any other country. And of course, we know it's a much longer list than the one I've just given, so pick your own red lines. So the key question is this: at what point must this country, to remain the country we identify as being, choose to disassociate itself from Trump's America? To say, look, okay, we're not enemies, but we are no longer allies. So we can no longer share intelligence because we believe you are compromised. Everything we do that creates vulnerability to you is something we now expect will be exploited and turned around and used against us. That's a message. If I were involved in campaigning, I would fashion a protest to send. Not to Trump. He's not listening. To the British government. Stand up to the tyrant. Stop appeasing him. Stop flattering. Stop grovelling to him. The US is no longer our ally, and at some point we need to have the integrity to deal with the consequences of that reality. And if not now, okay, but when? There is a stronger chance that that gets heard, not least because I guarantee you it's a dialogue government has been having, that they've been having inside their own heads even, and they're reminded of every time they have to interact with the White House. Such a protest on the street could be accompanied by targeted communication to MPs and other influential bodies, get international think tanks like Chatham House debating that framing of the question, get articles into foreign policy journals. It could be the start of a movement to get the British government to stand up for democracy and to defend that old international rules-based order, and to be clear that that is no longer what the United States represents. Now look, the argument against that would be, oh, it's too soon. Later we might have to do that, but not yet. And that's always going to be the argument. But the people protesting on the street have the right to be the first in demanding the change. Maybe they're too early, but they start the pressure to be felt. All right, now I'm going to go and Google Trump State Visit Britain protest and see what I find. I'm back. As expected, yes, there is a street demonstration planned for the first day of the visit. Trump not welcome is the slogan. And yes, it's a coalition of multiple groups, all part of the Stop Trump coalition. And who is it targeted at? As far as I can see, it's basically a scream into the void, very much framed in the language of left-wing campaign groups and primarily focused on Trump's support for Israel specifically, which is fine if that framing and the language isn't an actual barrier to the audience that you're seeking to address. But then what audience? Because in this case, to all appearances, it's about signalling dissent generally, not really focused on a specific audience, not based on a strategy of how you would actually change something. Hence, it will be easy for those who should be its target, whichever strategy you decide, to dismiss it as the usual dissenting voices. People who are campaigning on this today, but then a range of other issues every other day of a week probably. The coalition of professional campaigners, in other words. So, in answer to the question that was asked of me, what should Brits do? Or let's say, what could Brits do if they want to make a difference? Because I'm not here to tell you what you should do. Well, you can attend this demonstration if you want a nice day out, just the same as you could go to the park or visit a museum. I have no doubt there will be lots of good vibes, funny placards. You'll feel like you're part of something bigger. You will be surrounded by a bunch of people with whom you're guaranteed to have at least one thing in common. So that can be, I can tell from my long ago past experience, very, very positive. While it will intensely irritate active campaigners to hear me say it, this is not a campaign that has an achievable goal with a theory of change or a strategy attached. So if you want to do something more constructive, there's a variety of possibilities. I would do a little research, maybe find 10 members of parliament who have a track record of being the most clear about the reality of Trump. So Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, would be one of those. He is boycotting the state banquet, and he wrote to the King to explain why. If you could also get some Labour backbenchers, some Greens, Scottish Nationalists maybe, and preferably a Conservative backbencher as well, that would be a good group. Add in your own constituency MP and the Foreign Secretary. Write a personalised letter to each, expressing your view that the UK's current positioning with Trump's America is not sustainable, explain to them why, and tell them you want to encourage them after the state visit to seriously raise the profile of the question within Parliament. Ask them how they best believe this could be achieved. Because you're not meant to be the expert on parliamentary procedure. You just want to tell them how much you think this is important. Before the days of email, MPs used to rate that for every letter they got on an issue, there were about 100 other constituents who felt strongly about the same issue but hadn't gotten around to writing a letter. I don't know if they have a modern calculation for email, which is easier to send, but if you want to get attention, send them an actual physical letter through the post. That would then take you a couple of hours to do all that. Won't transform British politics overnight. No doubt less fun than attending a protest with like-minded people, but it will have more of a nudge in the places where there might be some cascading difference effect, rather than just one more face on the streets behind a very generic protest message. But it is the generic protest that will happen, because generally people respond in the most obvious ways to the most immediate and visible incentives. Hence why protest movements are rarely effective in the modern era, why they're often easily manipulated by their opponents, and even when by some accident of history they suddenly get a moment of higher profile, that moment is almost always squandered. Protest movements need to rediscover the power of proper strategy and leadership. But the age of social media, wafer-thin attention spans, and performative signalling in 280 characters at a time is not the natural habitat for effective campaigns. So look, having said all that, because that is my answer to that specific question, really it's not a problem. At the end of the day, the United States has to resolve its Trump problem. The UK is not going to be able to push them to do that, even with the best local campaign in the world in advance of the state visit. The UK is going to have to work out how it navigates a world where democratic decline has momentum and where Ukraine is still looking to overcome the country that is also bombarding us, by the way, with hacking attacks and disinformation and clearly acting as our determined enemy, and 20 other questions that are arising from this fast-changing moment. In the face of all of that, letting off some steam and venting about the ugliest face of democratic decline in what used to be the leader of the free world, that is just fine. No need to demand more of it than it seems like the appropriate thing to do. Just bear in mind that then after that, that's when the real work begins.